I want to welcome our listeners to another episode of the Bible GPS podcast. And as you guys already know, this is a joint venture between Core Ideas and the Bible GPS. I would like to welcome Dr. Willie McLeod and Pastor Carel Smith to the conversation. And I'm very excited to talk about the paradise or the Garden of Eden today. So really looking forward to that. We had a bit of a discussion before we started recording, and I think there's going to be some really interesting things brought forward. So welcome, Willie. Welcome, Carel.
Thank you, LeBay.
It's a pleasure to join you again today.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start off by this is sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Willie, you've been to paradise. Am I right?
Yeah, we'll first have to discuss where is paradise.
There you go.
And I think that's quite important because there are quite a few views in this regard. Some would locate paradise in southern Iraq, near the Persian Gulf. Others even as far as Africa, because of the reference in the King James Bible to Ethiopia, which is actually just Kis. And Kis is not necessarily Ethiopia, it's just an interpretation there. But so some goes according to that interpretation, finding it in the Great Lakes district in Africa. And then another opinion, which is more also my own way of thinking, is that we should locate it in the northern parts of north or northwestern Iran. Now, the reason for thinking so lies in the text. Let me just get the text here. In the New King James, it says, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, from where it departed and became 4 river heads. So this river heads, it seems to me that in the original, this is actually a reference to the headwaters of these rivers. And the headwaters immediately means it's in the area, the basin where these rivers originated. This is also, I think, the most basic way to make sense of it, especially regarding the identity of the different rivers. When one have a look at the identity of the rivers, 2 of them are quite easy. The one is the Euphrates and the other is the Tigris. But then there are 2 others. The one is the Gihon.
Yes.
Now, in my view, the Gihon is just what has become the Gaihun. So Gaihun, Gihon, it's clearly the same name. And that's an old name, which was changed after the Islamic invasion of the Caucasus to Arrakis. But before that, it was the Gaihun. So Gihon is clearly to me that same river. Of course, it's also, its source lies in the same area as the Euphrates and the Tigris. And then the other river is the Pishon. Now, Pishon, in my view, is dealt the Ushim. You can immediately see it's very similar, Pishon and Ushim. And we have a typical U to P shift here, Ushim, Pishon. So, in my view, these are the 4 rivers. So, it's the Gihon is just the old Gaihun, which later became the Arax. And the Pishon is just the Ushim. So these 4 rivers, all of them have their sources in the region of the Urmia, Lake Urmia and Lake Van in those northern parts of western Iran. And from there, all of them flows in different directions. So in my view, this is where we should be looking for the garden.
And Willie, So you referred to the 4 rivers, and that actually makes a lot of sense. Are there other indications in that area that points to the possibility or some of the older traditions?
Yeah, so let me just say the Gaian rises in the mountains to the north of the Van and Urmia rivers and flows eastward into the Caspian Sea. And the Uzum arises from springs in the area of Mount Sahant, east of Lake Urmia. I visited that area. I'll tell you a little bit later more about that. So these rivers flow from those areas which was where the headwaters had been, or still is to this day. What is interesting is that I've already mentioned the wrong reference, in my opinion, to Ethiopia in the King James Bible, the land of Cush. It says that the Gihon flows through the mountain of Cush, or it says through Cush. Now, Cush is actually in that area. We can actually find it in the mountain of Cush. The Gihon does, in fact, flow through that mountain. So we find that exact reference in that northern part. Also, the reference to the land of Avila, where there was gold. Also, we find that the Uzum had been called the Kezel Uzun, or dark red or gold. So all these things, in my view, points in the same direction. And this is that the garden must have been located maybe in the Tabriz area, around there. I think that's quite a good possibility. So in my way of thinking, this is where we should find the river.
Yes. If you look at Sumerian sort of mythology, is there anything else that features with regard to that?
Yeah, that's extremely important, what you're saying now. If in the Bible we read that the garden was situated towards the east.
Yes.
And this is exactly where we find this area, like Van, like the Urmia Lake. It's from towards the east from Israel. Now, what is interesting, this northern area in ancient times had been associated with the land of Arata.
Yes.
The only reference to Arata outside the ancient Sumerian texts is in the inscriptions regarding the campaign, the 8th military campaign of Sargon II of Assyria. And when he came, just there are different mountain ranges, and after passing all of these ranges towards the north, eventually when he came to Lake Urmia, we read that he crossed the river Arata.
Oh, okay.
So that's the only reference outside the ancient tales. So we have good reason to think that the land of Arata was situated in this region. This is just, in later terms, it became the Urartu civilization. And these people slowly but steadily migrated north, and they became what we know as the Armenians today.
Yes.
But from a biblical perspective, that's Ararat, the old ancient location of the land of Ararat. So that was in this northern region that this garden was located. And it makes sense because in the biblical way of thinking, there was the mountain of God. The Garden of Eden was closely connected with the mountain of God. For example, in Ezekiel 28 and 31, we will also read about the Garden of Eden. We find very clear reference to the mountain of God. In fact, it's actually could also be translated as the mountain of the gods.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That's a very strange translation, but in my Bible, in the Afrikaans Bible, it's actually translated exactly in this way, the mountain of the gods.
And it's just interesting. Eden comes from, there's a Sumerian word, Eden, and Edino is in Akkadian as well. That refers to steppe or plains. But
Yeah. So what is interesting is this area, there's actually, when you've passed through these 7 ranges, there are 7 ranges that had to be passed from the southern parts of Mesopotamia towards the north. Then you come to the plain of Tabriz. It's a beautiful plain. Today they have some some operations there, different industrial operations and so on. So there's some smoke in the area and so on, which is actually quite a pity. But a very nice area, and one can immediately see that this could have been the plan that's been referred to as the area where the Garden of Eden had been located. Yeah. So what I must also say is this: in the ancient tales from the Earth 3 period in Sumer, now it's from southern Sumer that one had to cross the 7 mountain range, and so we read how in Merkar, which was one of the ancient kings of Sumer, which I equate with the biblical Nimrod, how he sent a messenger towards the north to the land of Arata. And this messenger crossed the 7 ranges before he came to this mountain, this land in the north, the land of Arata. And what is interesting in some of these tales is reference is also made here of the mountain of the gods in the distant north. So in my way of thinking, there was a particular holy mountain. And on this mountain was a garden. It was a sacred garden. And in this most ancient of traditions, all the peoples of the ancient Middle East could have traced this ancient tales back to this location where this mountain of God or of the gods was located.
Perfect. So Carel, did you have anything to add to that? It looks like you were pondering something.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm just a preacher, but Willie is the specialist. But there is quite a few things that I think he can give some more insight into about this matter. Many people feel endangered when, for instance, there are correspondence between biblical themes and extra biblical or outside of the Bible traditions that corresponds. And for me, that's a very interesting topic applicable to this discussion. For instance, in these ancient Sumerian traditions, there are certain themes that correspond amazingly directly to the Bible stories and also the story of paradise. For instance, I think it is in the Epoch of Gilgamesh. There's also mention of a garden and of the mountain of God and the cherubim and the trees. And some people, some believers tend to think that they feel, what is bedreig?
Threatened.
Threatened, that's the word. They feel threatened. And because some people make the conclusion that the Bible is just another myth, because all these things tend to be myths out of these early what's a beschaving
Civilizations, yeah.
Yes. Out of these early civilizations. But Willie, now maybe you can answer on this. Maybe it's not just myths. Maybe it is all based on something which goes back very far, but which is based actually in truth. That there was such a garden and a mountain and the cherubim, and these actually confirm the truth of the Bible. It strengthens the tradition we have in the Bible. It doesn't have to endanger our beliefs. It can strengthen our belief. Maybe, Willie, you can say something about that.
Such a good point.
Yes, I think this is an extremely important point that you raise. So it depends on how we read Genesis, the book of Genesis. So biblical criticism scholars tend to read Genesis as a book that had been written very late. Most of them would date the book to the exilic or even post-exilic period. And in that case, obviously, if it was written so late, one do not expect anything that's of real historic value in the sense of historical data and information in Genesis. Now, another point of view, my own view, is that the information in Genesis, especially the primeval history, that's Genesis 1 to 11, the first part of 11, and then after that, the Abrahamic tradition. All of these things go back to a very ancient tradition that had been handed down in Abrahamic circles when the Abrahamic family migrated from Ur. Ur was located in Sumer towards Haran and then towards Canaan. So they brought, in my way of thinking, these traditions with them. It was the traditions of their own forefathers. So in this way of thinking, and I've written an academic article that had been published on this, so it's not just an interesting view, we have good academic, good arguments that can be satisfied from academic perspective regarding such a Sumerian hypothesis. Now, when one says that the Bible had been written late, the book of Genesis, then one assumes that the story of the garden was borrowed from the Babylonians. So this is often the view that the story was borrowed from the Babylonians. Now, this is extremely interesting. Ezekiel lived during the exile.
Yeah.
Now, what Ezekiel did is he locates the garden in the Lebanon mountains, towards the north. It's not the east, it's the north of Israel. He's in conflict with Genesis, because this is not how Genesis regards this. In Genesis, it's actually in the east. What is also interesting, in the book of Genesis, this book bears fruit. There was a tree in this garden, an enormous tree that bear fruit. Now, this tree that bore this fruit couldn't have been the cedar of Ezekiel, because we know cedar doesn't bear fruit, you know. So what Ezekiel says is a different way of thinking about the garden. For Ezekiel, it's not really about the location. It's just that the Lebanon mountains is a typical, let's say, an example of the holy mountain of God, which is not located on earth. So from Ezekiel's perspective and the way that he talks about these things, he has the celestial garden in mind.
So there's two things that I just wanted to point to. The one is that there's a cultural flow all through history. So we cannot look at let's say, Abram and his people outside of that cultural influence. So that's very important. Exactly. Yeah,
exactly. So when these things were written down, I believe, and I have good arguments to argue that Moses had written down the book of Genesis, and that especially this primeval history was handed down to him as source material from the fathers, going back even much earlier. So now, what is the difference? What Ezekiel, the way that he describes the garden, is exactly the same as in the Epic of Gilgamesh that Carel has just referred to. You see, what happened was, in that very early period in Sumer, the garden was located towards the north, towards Arata, in the north of Iran, across the 7 mountains. But after the Akkadian period, the Akkadians were Semites that ruled in Mesopotamia from about 2370 for about 200 years. These kings made long military campaigns towards the west. And the whole focus of Sumer shifted from the north towards the west. And that's why later, when we have the Gilgamesh epic that was written in an earlier Old Babylonian period, let's say about 1800 BC, the focus has shifted from the north towards the west.
Yes.
So that's why Gilgamesh is traveling towards the west. And in the west, in the Lebanon, at first in the earlier version in the Amanus, but later in the Lebanon, there he saw the mountain of the gods. There he saw this garden, he saw this massive cedar, and this cedar was also cut down in both narratives, in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the story of Ezekiel. So clearly, Ezekiel's way of presenting this is similar to what we found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That was the general way of thinking about these things in those times.
Yes.
But in Genesis, it's different. It goes back to a perspective that's older than the Akkadian period. That's about 2400 BC. It's older than that. That's amazing.
It's incredible.
So it shows us that this is a really old tradition. So the biblical tradition obviously didn't evolve in isolation, as you've just said. It evolved from a general tradition. If, let's say, there was such a mountain, that mountain would have existed very early in tradition, according to, depending on the translation you're using. If you're using the Septuagint, which I like, you would place it about 5,500 BC. In the Masoretic text, it's about 4,000 BC, but it's early. So if you place it that early, it's very long before the Bible was written. Moses is typically placed in about 1,400 BC.
Yeah.
So obviously, these were very old traditions, very, very old. And if these things really happened, we expect them to have been preserved in Sumerian tradition, but also if the biblical story and narrative is really true and trustworthy, it would also have been transmitted and handed down in biblical tradition. And this is exactly what we find. So this is a massive supportive evidence for the fact that the information in Genesis, and this is not all, there are lots of other information, but let's just stick to this because we're talking about the garden. So it shows that this is a very ancient narrative, and the story about the garden was not something that solely belonged to Israel. It was much older than Israel. It goes back long before Abraham's time, centuries and even millennia before Abraham's time, but it was handed down in the circles of the forefathers of Abraham, later in Abrahamic circles, the patriarchs, and eventually Moses wrote it down.
Willie, listening to you, it should be very important for us as believers to really put a proper effort into studying this extra biblical literature of ancient Sumer traditions, because that really sheds light on the context of the Bible and where it all started. So if we do not understand that tradition, we cannot really understand Genesis.
Can't say it better. That's so true. You see, if you read the book of Genesis in isolation, and you have absolutely no idea about the ancient world from which it originated, how could you understand it correctly? It's not written yesterday. It's not written in our current milieu and from our current perspective and a scientific point of view. It's not written in these terms. It comes from an extremely ancient tradition, and it's been written down. If Moses, as I believe, wrote it down, it was about 1,400 BC. And if this source material was handed down from the fathers, obviously it goes back even much, much further back in history. So if we understand the ancient world from which the Bible originated, really understand it. Remember, Abram came from Ur, the Bible says, of the Chaldeans.
Yes.
That's the Ur that was in Sumer. Ur was one of the most important cities in Sumer, in ancient Sumer. Now, the Chaldeans, obviously, they came much later after the time of Moses. But the editor here, I believe, is Ezra. The reason why he qualifies this Ur is to differentiate it from the Ur that was close to Haran, remembered also as Urfa. I also visited there, in that area. I visited all over the ancient Middle East. But that it refers to the Ur in ancient Sumer, which was especially important. It was close to Uruk, And it was towards the end of the Sumerian civilization. That was sort of the headquarters and the place from where the Sumerians ruled the ancient world.
So my next question is, there's two things that are sort of, it feels like it's sort of surfacing. Are we talking about a terrestrial Garden of Eden or a heavenly Garden of Eden? And if Carel, you wanted to answer that. you seem very excited about it.
I also wanted to, Willie actually said he was there. He was in paradise. He visited that very location which he mentioned. But obviously there have to be a physical location and also some spiritual or an heavenly connection, because it's not merely where people stayed, but like the mountain of God is where God and the angels were. So how do you differentiate between these two kind of paradises?
You're sort of hinting at the whole concept around first, second, third heaven, and whether it was sort of intertwined.
But start on earth. You were there.
Yeah, he was there. So,
well, if Adam and Eve was in paradise, it must have been on earth. But I believe that in the biblical talk, there's a difference between a heavenly paradise and the heavenly mountain of God. And then later in this series, I believe we will come back to the mountain of God and the council of the gods and all of these things, the sons of God. We'll discuss all these things. They're not yet there. But there's definitely the sense in the Bible that the heavenly celestial garden, mountain of God and the garden, as an earthly, let's call it a replica, within the mountain of God on earth. So in that sense, any mountain could have been viewed as a holy mountain and in a certain sense as a replica. Mount Zion is often in the Bible regarded as the earthly equivalent of God's heavenly mountain, for the simple reason that the temple was located there. But, for example, we've talked about the mountain in the Lebanon. So any high mountain could have been taken as a typical mountain of God, regarded as a holy mountain. And not only by the Israelites, even by all peoples around it. If you read through the book of Genesis, it seems that the mountain in Jerusalem, in Salem, was regarded as a holy mountain by all the peoples living in Israel during that earlier period, in the Abrahamic period. So when Abram got there, it was already a holy mountain. Melchizedek was there as priest king, and so Abram encountered this holy mountain, and all the peoples of Israel, of the land in that state, land of Canaan, they regarded that as a holy mountain. So when it comes to the mountain, the most ancient tradition about such a mountain, the oldest that we have, is this Sumerian tradition about a garden towards the north from Sumer, through 7 mountain ranges, and on top of that was this mountain of God and the garden. Now, it's possible one of those mountains, one of the beautiful mountains that I saw while visiting that area, is Mount Sahant. It's just a beautiful mountain, and it could have been regarded as a holy mountain. Through the ages, people had been living within the mountain. They've made structures in it's kind of soft material, and they live within the mountain. The houses and stuff are broken into the mountain, and they live within the mountain, and they've been doing that for ages. So it's a very strange and ancient place. What I found quite interesting in that area, there's, for example, towards the east of Lake Urmia, that's in the Lake Urmia area, and that's not far from Mount Sahant, is Marage. That's a town where there was an ancient astronomical observatory dating from about the 12th century, showing us that there's a very ancient tradition of observing the planets and the stars. Actually, in near Lake Urmia is the city or the town of Urmia, where we visited a place where it's remembered that one of the Magi which visited the baby Jesus in Jerusalem was buried. So there's an ancient tradition of such holy people coming from that region. In fact, there's another town called Malekan. That's not far from Sahand. And that had been translated as it's of the guardian angels. In line with the guardian angels that guarded the Garden of Eden. So these traditions are all located in that direct area surrounding Tabriz and the plain of Tabriz. And what is especially interesting is that the 7 mountain ranges is clearly symbolic. They're on the ground. I've traveled through them. We've counted them, one after the other, traveling from Suider in the south of Iran through the 7 mountain ranges. But they also refer to the 7 heavens. So in a celestial context, it refers to the 7 heavens through which, let's say, the soul has to travel before it reaches paradise, which is beyond.
Can you explain to the listeners what you mean by the 7 heavens? I think very few people know about that.
Yeah, I don't want to open the discussion too much at this point. I think we can come back at a later stage.
Perfect.
Because there's such a lot to discuss regarding this. But the point of the matter is just, here we have a beautiful replica of the celestial equivalent. So in the heavens, we have the 7 heavens. Paul referred to the 3rd heaven and also paradise, which is paradise was beyond the 3rd and beyond the 7th heaven. And that is on the mountain of God in the book of Ezekiel. That's where we have a whole story regarding that, what happened there, regarding that cherub that was in that garden and God over there on the mountain. But on earth, we have a replica. That's the model. And on earth, we have in the north, we have this mountain of God in the most ancient of traditions of such a mountain is in ancient Sumer. There's no one older than that.
No, it's very interesting.
It reads after traveling through the 7 mountain ranges towards the north.
Carel, you wanted to ask something?
Sorry to interrupt. But this is a very interesting point of a replica on Earth. Our discussion today is on paradise, but I've read somewhere in one of Andrew Murray's books that many of the things on Earth are replicas of or shadows of realities in heaven. For instance, the vine and the branches, Christ being the vine and we are the branches. You know, that is a very deep truth, which is described to us in the beautiful symbol of the vine. And now the same about replicas which God, or shadows or symbols which God placed on earth to teach us about the greater realities of those things existing in heaven.
Carel, I just wanted to comment on that as well, because it's really, I think our reality, we seem to think that this is the be all and end all, but there's a reality that's more a reality, and that's that supernatural reality. So we live in a very contained reality, and I think we need to sort of understand that as well. So, but yeah, I love that, the shadow.
And that's even true about the garden. What Willie mentioned now, that on earth it was merely a replica, but there's also in heaven, there's a paradise.
I can also mention that this garden was also situated or located in the starry heavens, in the celestial skies. So the ancients actually saw in the celestial skies a kind of reflection of the invisible world. This is something that we already find with the Sumerians. They didn't only look at the stars and see stars. They connected the stars with gods. But that doesn't mean that they saw the star as the god. The gods were invisible. There was an invisible world that's impossible for us to see with our physical eyes. But the starry heavens, in a certain way to them, was a kind of replica, a kind of mirror image of that which is beyond and which can't be seen by the eyes. So in that sense, the seven heavens is obviously based on the circular paths of the seven planets. That's those that could be seen with the eyes. And the celestial paradise and the mountain of God were situated or located in the area of the northern pole of the heavens. But this is a discussion for another day, but it's fascinating, and we find it throughout the Bible, also in biblical tradition, but obviously not restricted to biblical tradition that the ancients had.
So, Willie, I always thought that if I really search hard enough, I will find paradise on earth. But I think it seems that I'm wrong.
Well, you see, you can go there. I was there in Tabriz and the plain, and I visited all those areas. As I said, the burial place of one of the Magi of, tradition, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's very interesting, visiting all these places, traveling to all these places, traveling through the seven mountain ranges. I've been to many places all over the ancient world when I was writing my books, different books that I wrote. But the interesting thing is, you should also go back to this right period in time.
That's true.
So if you want to visit paradise, you'll have to go back 5,500 BC. Otherwise, it has changed, and the world has changed, and it's not. You can't just go and see here's paradise,
Put my focus on the heavenly paradise. Today.
I just wanted to read something, and then I wanted to move on to another point. But this is from Sumerian literature, and it says the land of Goldman is pure, the land of Goldman is clean. The land Dolman is clean, the land Dolman is most bright. In Dolman, the raven utters no cries, the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb. Unknown is the kid devouring wild dog. Its old woman says not, I am an old woman. Its old man says not, I am an old man. Fascinating.
Yeah, Dolman is a pure place. Dolman is actually a reference to an area in the southern Gulf, in the Persian Gulf. At first, it was a wider area, but from about 2,500 BC, it referred to the island of Bahrain.
Yes.
And the pureness here refers actually to the fountains. There's some fountains within the sea. The sea is not very deep, and there's some fountains there, freshwater fountains. So in the sea, you find fresh areas of fresh water. Fascinating, and in a certain sense, Dolman was also regarded as a kind of paradise, kind of place of paradise. But Dolman, in my way of thinking, was actually identified with Hades, with the island of the blessed dead, the region where the blessed dead goes.
That's interesting.
So when Gilgamesh took the voyage towards Dolman to see what we would call the equivalent of the biblical Noah and his wife. This represents the area where the blessed dead resided. And there are thousands and thousands of burial hills, mounts there on this island. It's amazing. As far as you look, it's just a sea of mounts. It's beautiful. And it has been suggested that some people, at least in Mesopotamia, assumingly the richer and the royals and so on, asked to be buried on Bahrain on Dumun. And this is also interesting because in the biblical perspective, paradise is not only located on the mountain of God, as we have seen in Ezekiel, it's also located in the region, or in Hades, the region of the blessed dead. Jesus said to the man on the cross, today, in paradise, he refers to paradise. So yeah.
You wanted to say, Carel?
He said, today you will be with me in paradise.
Exactly. Today you will be with me in paradise. So in that reference is not to the celestial paradise in the sense of the one on the mountain of God. This is paradise in reference to the isle or the region of the blessed dead, where Jesus pronounced his great victory, and he took the blessed dead with him when he rose from the dead. In my way of understanding this, what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 1. So there's also in the background, we must remember, it's not only the region, this Garden of Eden is only used for the paradise on top of the mountain or on the mountain of God. But there's also a paradise in the region of the blessed dead, where they were located. Yeah.
So if we can, sorry, go ahead, Carel.
Sorry, the story where Jesus said that Lazarus went to Abraham in paradise.
Yeah, I read it in exactly that way.
Yeah. So just to take a step back into the terrestrial Garden of Eden, the reference to the two trees. Carel, did you have any sort of thoughts around that? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Was it physical? I see Willie smiling.
Yeah, I don't think, I wouldn't say anything about it now. I'll let Willie talk about that. That's next time's topic.
Yeah, I think we should return next time to this, because
we can do that, yes.
That's quite a long discussion. But what I can say at this stage is this tree is situated in the middle of the garden. And in Ezekiel's description of the tree, it's an enormous tree. He says that all the different nations sat in the shadow of that tree, and all the animals and all the birds. So this is a massive tree, and it's the same that we read in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a very, very large tree. It actually refers to the Axismundi. So in our day and age, people are not really concerned with the heavens. But if you take time and go on a holiday and spend some time on a farm and you look at the starry heavens, then you'll see that the heavens rotate. And there's a certain place or a spot in the northern, we won't be able to see it from South Africa in the northern heavens, but also in the southern heavens, there's a spot around. It seems that the heavens rotate around this spot. So this seems to be a static point that doesn't move. It's like the axis of the heavens. So it's like the earth has a certain axis projecting towards the north and the south. And this is exactly what it is. It's the earth's rotation projects towards the north and the south, and it gives the illusion that all the stars rotate around this axis. Now, this axis, imaginary axis, which can be observed in a certain sense in the celestial skies, was described in various terms, but among others as a massive tree, very, very large tree. It's called the Axismundi, And there's no doubt that in Ezekiel's description, this is what is referred to also in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So again, we're back at the celestial aspect. So regarding the tree on the ground in the garden, I think next time we can talk about that a little bit further, but just to say how one could also see a celestial equivalent for this tree in the garden.
I want to make a final comment from my side, and if there's anything else you guys would like to add. I think it just sort of brings us back to that point where you cannot read the Bible and then specifically Genesis just on the surface. You are talking about there's culture, there is this whole interaction between terrestrial and extraterrestrial or heavenly. Things are much more complex than what we see when you just read the lines, and we have to be more focused on going deeper and willing to do that. So any other final thoughts from your side, Carel?
It's just amazing to me, thanks Lebay, how these old traditions confirm the integrity of the Bible, that if you study the text properly, it confirms that it's a really old text written in an ancient tradition, and that it is indeed a trustworthy source that the Lord has given us, His Word.
Absolutely. And Willie?
I think, but this whole difference between the way of that the garden is described in the book of Genesis chapter 2 and in Ezekiel chapters 28 and 31 actually is an extremely strong argument for the trustworthiness of the information given in the book of Genesis, as Carel has just mentioned. So it just shows us, this is just not stories that has been made up later on and so forth, as people often say. And I think so often the people that's allowed to say, this is just nonsense, this is just stories, there's no evidence, it's not true, it doesn't, all these kind of things, they themselves do not know a lot about the topic. And scholars often that study these things are within a certain paradigm of thinking. For example, the biblical criticism scholar, he believes that this was written late after the exile. And as he believed this, obviously, there cannot be any truth within the book of Genesis. That's why he doesn't take it serious that it has a historical information. But it shows you how even scholars often are situated in a certain paradigm. Now, Thomas Kuhn is a very well-known philosopher. He actually first postulated this idea of paradigms and the scholarly paradigm, where the scholar in that paradigm is he just can't remove himself from a very fixed way of thinking. And he believes that he alone knows everything and he has all the answers. But in actual fact, he is totally in illusion about his own facts and ideas, because he is within a certain paradigm. He's in a box. He only sees what he wants to see in the box. He can't see out of the box. It doesn't have a wider picture. And it's well known in philosophy, this reference to scholarly paradigms. So I'm not now talking about people on the ground, lay people. I'm talking about scholars in a scholarly paradigm, missing the facts on the ground. And well, that's a pity, but it's true.
And I think that's why it's important to be very cautious when you just blindly read stuff, to see it as the law of Medes and Persians, eh?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we'll finish up with that. I'm actually really excited about our next conversation, and I really appreciate it, guys. I appreciate your time, and I think this was absolutely fantastic. For our listeners, I'll put the link down to Core Ideas. There's quite a few really interesting articles. Please go and have a look at that. And then if you have any other questions or topics you would like us to discuss or drill down into, do not hesitate to send us a little message or an email.
Lebay, they can also go and visit my blog, where there's quite a few articles.
And I will again add the link to the blog as well. Thank you for reminding me, Willie.